Hi, everyone. So we've talked about noun phrases. Now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about noun clauses and how noun clauses can function in sentences. So noun clauses are like a little bit of a misnomer, meaning we're not strictly speaking dealing with nouns, but rather dealing with clauses, right? So functionally sentences that have a clear subject predicate, right? That fill the function of nouns, right? So if you think about how nouns usually function in sentences, they might function like subjects, subject complements, direct objects, the objects of the preposition, right? So what we're talking about are clauses that fill those same functions. And I will write functions here, just as a reminder. So we can have the subject function, we can have a subject complement, a direct object, the object of the prepositional phrase, right? So just think about those types of functions. The other like aspect of noun clauses that's really important, so this is how you know you're dealing with a noun clause and not like an adverbial or an adjectival, is they cannot be removed um, for it to be a grammatically complete sentence, right? So in other words, they are essential. Without it, something would be missing. So noun clauses are like important. And so understanding what we mean by noun clause, not a noun, but a clause that functions like a noun functions. Okay. So there are three different types of noun clauses, and this video is going to focus on the first type, which is the declarative noun clause, often attached to kind of declarative sentences. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at a variety of different examples. So I have two sentences written here, both, well, I should say, a sentence that I broke down, but the source is Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. So humans had cast them aside. That was good, right? So here we have two sentences, and what noun clauses or clauses that function like nouns allow us to do is to combine them. So I'm going to tell you about that, and then we're going to actually perform that. So one way to determine or identify noun clauses is that noun clauses can be replaced by this or that, right? And here we have an example of a noun clause being replaced, and I'll just go ahead and write and see up here so that way you remember what that abbreviation is for. So that was good replaces our noun clause. This was good could also replace it. Yet, right, the noun clause should function like the pronoun that replaces it, right? So here we have a subject, our predicate, and a subject complement. So that means if we have a noun clause, so humans had cast them aside, we're going to say this is our noun clause, it should replace that and function like the subject, right? So if we do that, we would end up saying that humans had cast them aside was good. right? So our predicate and our subject complement do not change. What changes or transforms here is our noun clause, which functions like the subject, right? So when we're talking about noun clauses, what they allow us to do is to put in like a whole clause, right? Something else that has a clear subject and a clear predicate, right? Fits in for that entire word. So we're looking at a full clause that functions like a single noun would function. Okay. So let's look at another example. So let's take a look at these sentences. I prayed that he'd find me versus I'd pray. Sorry, I prayed he'd find me. So this particular type of noun clause is what we call a zero complementizer. Okay. It just means that, right, when the noun clause functions like a direct object, that can be dropped. Okay. So let's take a look at what I mean, right? We have our subject and our predicate here. Okay. Um, He'd find me is a noun clause that functions like a direct object, right? So what that allows us to do then is to cross out this that. So instead of saying I prayed that he'd find me, we can just say I prayed he'd find me. This is an interesting dimension. So here we have a relative clause, right? That is a relative pronoun. So it's a relative clause that's functioning like a noun, which makes it a relative clause that's a noun clause. Um, so here, one of the interesting things we do in English is we often drop the that. So because we tend to drop that, sometimes it's hard to be able to tell when we have a that relative clause. So just be aware that the zero complementizer or dropping the that is something we do quite often. So interesting dimension, right, to English as a language. Let's take a look at the next kind of form or way that noun clauses can operate. And I am just going to go ahead and write on the side, right? This is the noun clause functioning as a subject. This is the noun clause functioning as the direct object. So this is the noun clause functioning as the object of the prepositional phrase. So let's go ahead and take a look. So I took no small amount of pride in the fact that my fingers didn't tremble. So here, right, we have in as a preposition, okay, and then the fact that my fingers didn't tremble, right? This whole thing functions like the object of the prepositional phrase. That is our relative pronoun, right? And once again, right, we have our subject, which is my fingers, and didn't tremble functions as our predicate. So we have a clause, right, because we have that subject predicate relationship. So in order to have a noun clause as the object of the preposition requires in the fact that. Okay. So anytime we have a clause that functions like an object of a preposition, it is always going to be preceded by the phrase in the fact that. Okay. So just be aware that that signifies that we have a clause that's functioning like a noun would, right? But it has to be preceded by the phrase in the fact that, just like in the example above. Okay. The next example is going to show us or kind of teach us about the anticipatory it. And that is what it's called. So anticipatory it can be used in place of subjects, right? So I'm going to scroll up for just a minute and remind you, right, of our first use of that as a subject. That humans had cast them aside was good, right? Little bit of a clunky sentence, still grammatically totally fine, but it's a little cumbersome to say. So let's take a look at what happens if we come down to the anticipatory it. Instead of saying that humans had cast them aside was good, instead, we can replace it with it, right? Which introduces or anticipates, right? This noun clause that functions like a subject, so it is functioning like a subject. And we can say it was good that humans had cast them aside. So it means the same thing, but it's a little bit more conversational or less formal to say, which makes it a little less cumbersome. The next example I want to offer focuses on a noun clause as a subject complement. Okay. It was that breathy chuckle. And who was that? So in this instance, we have both an anticipatory it, right? Um, in this case, the anticipatory it um, is referring to that breathy chuckle, which functions like a subject complement. So we have a subject complement, and was is functioning as that predicate, right? So here, we don't have like an additional word before the noun clause, that breathy chuckle. It's just functioning like a subject complement would. Similarly, who was that? We have a subject complement, a subject, and our predicate. Okay. So in this case, we have just a relative pronoun. Okay. Who is also a relative pronoun. Okay. Um, but in these instances, right, all of these are functioning as subject complements. So what this means is that a clause can function like a subject complement. Okay. The last thing I want to discuss is dialogue. Okay. Um, His dialogue is weird, but sometimes grammatically speaking, we don't always know what to do with it, which I think is quite interesting. So I have it didn't, Tamlin said. So let's talk a little bit about how dialogue functions in the sentence. Tamlin is the subject and said is the predicate, right? So what's interesting is that even though it didn't comes at the beginning of the sentence, this is what is being said. So this whole clause functions as a direct object, right? It has its own subject, its own predicate. So it's a clause. So something interesting here is we could say it or that. Um, and we could replace it. Tamlin said that, right? Um, Functions as a sentence. So we can replace it didn't with that, which is now in the official direct object position. That also means that we could say Tamlin said, comma, It didn't. So the key here is that when you have dialogue, it functions as a direct object, right? And if you need help figuring this out, you can replace it, that, or this. And that can help show you how it is that that dialogue is functioning. So all you need to know is that these different examples of how clauses can fill functions in sentences um, are all illustrations of noun clauses and type 1 noun clauses that function within declarative sentences. The other ways that noun clauses can function will happen in reference to yes, no questions and WH questions. So we'll talk about those in separate videos. But here, the important thing is that clauses, so entire clauses, can act the same way nouns do in sentences and fill the same types of functions. So that's what I'm going to be looking for. Can you identify the clause that fills the function of a subject? Can you identify the dialogue that fills the function of a direct object, right? These sorts of things are useful for us to know, especially if any of you end up teaching and kids ask you about it. Where's the direct object? Well, in this case, it's there. It's just that entire like line of dialogue, right? Everything in quotation marks is the direct object. So hopefully this was helpful. We'll talk a little bit more about noun clauses in a couple of other videos.